Leaders from China, Japan and the Republic of Korea get together for a trilateral meeting in Tokyo. Trade and nuclear issues were on the agenda. Hello, I'm Arland Naidu and this is The Heat. Leaders from China, Japan and the Republic of Korea have met in Tokyo for trilateral talks, the first such meeting in over 2 years. The meeting was hosted by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was joined by Chinese Premier Keqiang and the Republic of Korea President Moon Jae-in. They expressed a commitment to free trade and globalization, and they agreed to push for the nuclearization of the Korean peninsula. For more on all of this, let's hear from our panel. Joining me now from Beijing is Shinzo Xu. He is a senior researcher at the Pango Institution. With us from New York is Myung-koo Kang. He is a professor of political science at Baruch College and is an expert on Korean political issues. Also joining us from Pittsburgh is Kei Shimizu. She is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh. And also with us here in the studio is Brian Becker. He is an analyst on US DPRK relations, and he has visited the DPRK several times. Welcome to all of you to the show. Shinzo, let me start with you. Of course, there's a lot going on at this trilateral summit that's of importance to all three countries, the nuclear issue on the Korean peninsula, of course, and trade issues as well. This is the first time this is happening in 2 years. How important is this meeting?
Well, I think first of all, this resumption of the trilateral meetings after a hiatus of 2.5 years represents this commitment of the three countries for regional integration, for regional peace and stability. So this is a step forward. And secondly, of course, it helps a lot in terms of bringing back to track China-Japan relationship. This is the first visit by Chinese premier for 8 years, in 80 years. And thirdly, you see basically three countries, which includes the second and the third largest economies in the world. They are speaking with a one voice against the rise of protectionism and, of course, unilateralism, mostly practiced by President Trump in the United States. So they are a strong voice for free trade and globalization. So this is very important, a very positive development here.
Myung-koo Kang, as we just heard from Shinzo, these three countries represent some of the biggest economies in the world. And as we also heard, they reiterated their commitment there to free trade and globalization. And that led the Japan Times to say, and I'm quoting here, this was a not-so-veiled dig at US President Donald Trump's America First protectionist agenda. So how do you assess the trade message that's coming out of this trilateral summit?
I mean, the declaration, joint statement, made it quite clear these three countries will make collective efforts to accelerate, regional comprehensive economic partnership. It's composed of 16 member countries. These three countries, China, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN 10 countries, and including India, Australia, and New Zealand. If we include all these 16 countries, it's the largest trading bloc. And if we specifically look at the Japanese trade, destination to Asia is more than half of Japanese export. South Korea exactly same. And China is a little bit different, but China is also very important, production network hub in the global economy. So these three countries made it quite clear they're going to support free trade regime and then free flow of investment and even people and cultural exchange. So I think that this reaffirmation of free trade regime against Donald Trump-style kind of protectionism, I think is a very important message.
All right, let's bring in Kei Shimizu from Pittsburgh. And Kei, the Chinese Premier Keqiang also pledged to accelerate negotiations for a China, Japan, South Korea free trade zone and to achieve that regional comprehensive economic partnership known as the RCEP. What do you see come out of this? What do you see developing in terms of trade from these three countries?
I agree with the other two guests that this is really a chance for these three countries to band together and accelerate the free trade agreements as well as the globalization that is what RCEP represents. Prime Minister Abe went to the United States last month in hopes of getting some concessions out of Donald Trump. especially for the steel and aluminum tariffs that Japan has been fighting against, and only to bring home very little to show for his efforts. And so this meeting really allows Prime Minister Abe to recommit Japan to free trade agreements and globalization with its most important regional trading partners, South Korea as well as China.
Brian, of course, the other big news that's relevant to all three of these countries, the latest developments on the scheduled meeting between President Donald Trump and the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Kim Jong-un. We now have a date, we now have a place, Singapore, June 12th. This is what President Trump had to say in a tweet. He said, "The highly anticipated meeting between Kim Jong-un and myself will take place in Singapore on June 12th. We will both try to make it a very special moment for world peace." Are you surprised in any way how quickly this happened?
Well, it's hard not to be surprised, of course, because the situation was frozen in terms of U.S.-DPRK relations for a half a century. And suddenly, with such amazing dynamism, everything seems to be back on the table. So the situation is pregnant with new possibilities. But as a result, really not because of Donald Trump's pressure on North Korea, which of course he's crowing about, but because the North Koreans and the South Koreans understood that there was an opportunity. They created momentum between the two entities. And then the South Korean envoy came and met with Donald Trump and said, "Kim Jong-un wants to meet with you." And to the shock of all of even Donald Trump's advisors, he said on the spot, "Yes, let's do it." Donald Trump really has a lot at stake here. I mean, the DPRK, I think, has choreographed this diplomacy in a way that makes it very, very hard for the United States to simply walk away from the table in Singapore.
The first big action, Brian, has come from the DPRK. They've released the 3 Americans who are now back in the United States. Donald Trump goes to this meeting. He cannot walk away from it empty-handed.
Yeah, he's in a way in a bind. And, you know, the interesting thing, when we heard our earlier piece and the other guests, you know, it's ironic, maybe the irony of history, that the post-World War II world order that the U.S. created and was the anchor of is being undone by the actions of the American president. And so right now, he's just ripped up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. He's also withdrawn from the Paris Climate Treaty. He's gotten the U.S. out of TPP. He has nothing to show for anything except this. And thus, I'd say the United States is in a fairly vulnerable position if it decides to walk away without providing any framework for a negotiated outcome.
Shinzo, the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un, he held another meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. That meeting took place in Dalian. What is China hoping that will come out of this meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Trump?
Well, I think China, along with South Korea and Japan, as expressed in one document by the 3 countries, that is, they would love to see this ultimate denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula, and at the same time, they would see peace and prosperity to be brought back to Northeast Asia, this whole region. So I think China supports the efforts by the U.S. side, by North Korean side, to talk about you know, like arranged or step-by-step, like a denuclearization efforts at the same time to address the security concerns of Pyongyang. And then I think China also expressed its support to Pyongyang's efforts, basically to develop or to shift its attention from developing nuclear weapons or missiles to economic growth or improvement of the people's living standard. Basically, that's a message in the latest meeting between President Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un.
Myung-koo, it was just a few days ago that President Trump violated that nuclear deal with Iran, known as the JCPOA. Right. He tore that deal up. So how much of an impact is that going to have in these upcoming talks with the DPRK on a nuclear issue again?
I mean, as far as I know, the North Korean Kim Jong-un and the North Korean government made it quite clear the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal will not have quite significant impact about the coming Kim Jong-un and then Trump summit. So denuclearization of North Korea is a separate issue. That's the official position. But what we have to pay attention to is 2 things. One is, as you asked the question, you know, President Xi Jinping and then Kim Jong-un's this second summit meeting happened as a request of the North Korean government, according to China's government announcement. And also important thing is that the American government seems to have increased, set up the bar of denuclearization of North Korea, pretty high. So not just including denuclearization of North Korea, but at the same time, weapons of mass destructions and a human rights issue, Japanese abductee issue, and all such kind of thing. So from the North Korean government point of view, in a sense, counterbalancing against, increasing American pressure in terms of the coming, summit meeting, I think that's the significance of the President Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un's meeting, because it was requested by the North Korean government.
Right. Myung-koo, I take your point about this being a separate issue, a separate set of negotiations, but is there a question mark over U.S. credibility in this kind of process, or over whether the U.S. can be trusted? I mean, what's to stop a future president tearing up an agreement that is signed by President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
Exactly. I mean, U.S. government credibility is very, very important issue in this, withdrawal from the Iran deal. Because if we go back to 1994, the agreed framework between the United States and, at that time, North Korea, in fact, Clinton administration reached an agreement with North Korean government, but there was a midterm election, and the Republican Party took over the U.S. Congress. And the Republican party did not support the Clinton administration's commitment, agreed framework with North Korea. So there were kind of some historical, some bait and switch kind of distrust or credibility issue, whether the U.S. government will continue or the North Korean government will continue and stick to its own commitment. So I think that credibility issue will be quite a significant agenda or issue in the coming summit meeting between President Trump and then Kim Jong-un.
Kim, so far, the leader of the DPRK, the leader of the DPRK, Kim Jong-un, has met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. He's also met with the South Korean leader Moon Jae-in. And the Chinese Premier, Keqiang, says there is now a possibility of a dialogue between the DPRK and Japan. Do you see that happening?
Well, certainly in the three-country summit that just occurred, there was much pressure on Shinzo Abe to meet with Kim Jong-un in the future from both the South Koreans and the Chinese side. In contrast, Prime Minister Abe's position has been much more strongly towards the comprehensive denuclearization of the peninsula first before any such negotiations occur. But however, Abe has found himself rather isolated in this stance, as the United States has already agreed, or President Trump has agreed, to meet with Kim Jong-un. So certainly, especially if Shinzo Abe is to solve the abductee issue, a meeting between a Japanese Prime Minister and Kim Jong-un in the future has got to be on the table for him at some point.
Brian, what do you think? Do you see a meeting taking place?
Well, I mean, I agree. I think it's because Shinzo Abe has become isolated in the international process and is also facing problems at home at the same time. His position before of kind of an extreme nationalism, I would say xenophobia, and a refusal to take responsibility for Japan's actions in Korea were such that it would have seemed impossible. But now I think it could happen. Again, Abe and all of the leaders in the area have to realize that if anybody stands apart right now, here's a train. A train has sort of left the station, the peace train, so to speak, to use an old song cliche. The peace train is left, and do they get on the train or do they stay off? If everybody else seems to be getting on, certainly Shinzo Abe cannot afford, Japan cannot afford to stand aside. So there's extreme pressure for such a meeting.
It's Cat Stevens, right?
Cat Stevens.
All right, we have to take a quick break. Much more on the China, Japan, and ROK trilateral meeting and the issues surrounding it when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.